Hello, in this lesson we will cover Chapter 6, General Maintenance. We'll actually split this chapter into two different lessons. In the first lesson, as you can see, I'm looking at the table of contents in the new client handbook. In Chapter 6, in the first part 1 of that, the first lesson will cover departments, entity file roles, users, and possibly in this lesson user preferences. And then part 2 will cover backups, password changes, and vendor payees. Well, in this this section, for the most part, there's only one set of exercises. This is going to be a little bit free-flowing, so you're welcome to read over the book. Most of in this handbook, what we've done is, for the most part, just cut and paste information from the Accounting and General Manual. So you'll find all of this in the Accounting and General Manual using the Need Help button or the other methods I mentioned at the beginning of the class of accessing that manual. So I'm actually just going to skip to the back of the chapter here, because we'll be going over exercises 1 and 2 shortly, and we'll just flip to the software. All right, in the UN software, it looks like I already have this open. I didn't mean to do that, but if you'll notice that we've been camping out all class, and for the most part in the accounting module. And remember how I mentioned that the accounting application or software is made up, or actually the UN application or software, more specifically, is made up of several modules, or you can call them other applications. We call them modules here. Our primary module is the accounting module. That's what we've been working with. And here you have your main menu for the accounting module. It's September 2011 right now, and then by 2013, currently it's scheduled to have the payroll module available for anyone who wants that. Then we've got budget and inventory, which are currently available on optional add-on modules that you can use. And we will be having sometime in the near future the cemetery module in addition to that. So those aren't the subject of this class, but the reason I mention that is because the general module applies to all of those areas. So for the most part, the settings under the general module, anything that is relevant to all those areas, we'll try to put them, or all the other modules, we'll try to place them in the general module maintenance menu. Now, as you can see, when I selected general, the transactions and utilities menu items options are not even available. And I don't suspect those will ever be available, but it's possible. But for right now, it's just maintenance and reports related to maintenance. If I click on maintenance, you can see all of my maintenance options, and then reports and statements, for the most part, relate to those maintenance options. So we'll go back to general maintenance. And again, in this lesson, we're going to cover about half of this. The first thing we're going to cover is the easiest part. We're going to go by order of that table of contents. The first thing on page 93 is departments. And that's the easiest one to show you. Feel free to read the material. But departments, when I click on departments, you'll see that it opens up the departments area. And this, as it says in the book on page 92, I believe, the departments area is applicable in a future software enhancement. So in other words, basically this doesn't apply to you right now. We will explain it fully. It's going to be an optional feature for our UN customers at that time, so it won't be required. We don't have a full explanation for you right now, or we do have some information in the book, but you can read up on. But basically, right now, add department, and it will have no effect on your UAN software. So basically, this exercise is just to show you that it exists, and you can ignore it for now. All right. So the next chapter on page 97, I'm actually going to work on exercise on page 109, is the entity setup. Now before we get to that, I want to point out one thing about the help features for this general maintenance area. Remember I had mentioned at the beginning of class we had I mentioned the options of to open the Need Help button, how they're screen specific. So if you click on the Need Help button, it's really nice. We were just in departments, and now it opens up the departments overview and gives me I can get all the information we have currently on this departments, which is not too much, but it's there. So open up screen specific information. Well, I mentioned that sometimes it doesn't do that, and under maintenance, well, this is where we see a number of those exceptions to the rule, and that's because a lot of the menu options under the general maintenance area open up to pop-up windows. So our next section is Entity Setup. If I click on Entity Setup, it opens up this separate window, Entity Setup. And even if I'm in there, if I click on Need Help from the main menu here, notice it just opens up Departments again. That's because that was the last area that I opened. The last, when we talk about areas, talk about when you get a tab at the top of the screen here and it shows you many options, a list that you can create and so forth. So really the Need Help only works for those areas, but that doesn't mean that you can't find information. You just have to know how to do it. So for the entity setup, I click on Need Help, okay, opens up Departments. I can either go to my table of contents and find departments here, or I can use the option, the menu on the left, the bookmarks on the left. Clicking these plus and minus buttons, I can collapse all of them to plus, so you can see that this is these are my options for the Accounting and General Manual. And here we have General Maintenance. If I expand that, I could see all the sections under General Maintenance. So here I'll find Departments or Entity Setup, and here are all my step-by-step instructions, detailed information related to the entity setup. Same thing for a number of the other suggestions here, like change password and so forth. Many of these are separate windows, and so it's not going to automatically open when you click on Need Help. You can find it right here. All right, so back to our exercise in our booklet. I'll record this exercise as we go, basically just to kind of give you an overview. As you can see, we've got an assistant, remember Buckeye Township, bad joke, so our assistant is Trustful Prior, and so we're going to change some information there under Entity Setup. So I'll work through that. So I click on General Maintenance Entity Setup, and this screen looks a bit different than some of the screens you've seen. It has tabs going across the left-hand side of the screen. Each of these tabs represents a different page within this form. Okay, so here's the entity information in the Entity Setup form. If you click on System, here's a page with other information about which I'll discuss: modules, purchase orders, payments. Anytime I can save any changes I make in one of these screens, clicking the Save button, and it just brings me back to the first tab on the screen. And it's saved every tab related to that screen, or to this form. All right, so let's look at the Entity Information tab. Well, here we've got, as you can see, color of the background, it's read-only, the entity name, type, county, and UAN entity ID. Well, these first three fields are going to, you should obviously know your correct entity, if you're a township, village, library, special district, what your name is, your entity type, you know, if it's township, village, or library, and or district, and the county that it resides in. Now, of course, we'll provide you with the entity ID. This is a UEN number that we use. The first thing, for those of you who are converting from some other non-UEN system to UEN, one of the first things you should do once you log into the program is go right here to this entity setup and check these four fields. The first three, you'll know if they're correct or not. If they're incorrect, or if you've got the wrong entity name description, maybe it's, you know, here we get Buckeye Township, maybe yours is, you know, Buckeye Field Township or whatever, and we just had Buckeye. You want to call, or maybe it's a township and it really should be a village. You want to call the UEN support line right away and let us know so we can have a tech support person fix this immediately before you get started. Because this will show up on reports. If tech support has to fix it, I'm not sure if that means you're going to have to redo some of your information. Maybe, maybe not. But you want to get it corrected immediately. That way the wrong information doesn't show up on some of your reports and documentation. Okay, so assuming this is all correct, look at your UEN entity ID. You want to write that down somewhere. Whenever you call the UEN support line or you send an email to our support email, please include this number identified as your UEN entity number. And that helps us a lot. It'll help you a lot in saving a lot of time on support calls. So we can pull up your call history. We can pull up some specifics about your entity. And it really helps us a lot if you just give us that 4-digit number. And speed up your call. If you leave a voicemail as well on our support line, if you call after hours, please also include this entity number. All right, then we've got two required fields here, your Ohio tax ID and your federal tax ID. Well, at UEN we have no idea what this is, our programmers don't, so we just fill it in with once. Okay, so one of the things you have to do from the get-go is to fill this in when you first convert to UEN. So it's one of the things you'll do. If you are not converting, if you're a new fiscal officer, but you can always double check this information by coming here and make corrections if needed and save them. All right, then you've got optionally, but I think you'd probably want to fill in all this information: address, city, phone, etc. Your email address. When you close for year end, UEN gets the email that you have listed here. So we really appreciate having the most useful email that you have to contact you. If it's one of the web-based ones, you know, one of the free web-based ones, that's fine. Doesn't have to be like BuckeyeTownship.org. It could be one of the common web-based email addresses. Whatever email that you use the most, we would love to have that so that if we have any updates that we send by email only, you'll get them as soon as possible. Any updates mean information that we have about UEN or changes and so forth. And then below that is the fiscal officer name. So here we have Buckeye Township with Bruce Buckeye. You'll want that. That'll show up on certain reports and on forms, like with the purchase orders. You've got your fiscal officer name. If this is incorrect or blank, then it won't show up automatically on those reports. And if you have any assistance, again, like our silly example, type that in and save it. And that's it. So pretty straightforward screen. I'll move on to the next page, which is System. And here we've got compliance controls, budgetary, and UEN backup interval. Well, the compliance controls we're going to cover in, I believe that's chapter 7. We have a whole chapter devoted to this in and a little bit to reserve balance accounts. But so we're going to return to this, and you'll want to watch that video, go over this in detail. I will say just briefly here, this is the default stop user when not in compliance, and it's our recommendation, but not a rule, but we highly recommend that you consider this closely. And again, our default setting is stop user. My personal recommendation is you leave it right there unless you've got a very, very good reason. And again, we'll discuss that in a separate chapter. Okay, so we'll skip to budgetary. Budgetary, well, this is if you have agency funds at your entity. In your personal fund chart of accounts, do you guys use agency funds? Well, if you're not sure what an agency fund is, you probably don't have it, but maybe not. You can check your township, village, or library chart of accounts. So if you go to accounting appendices under need help, check your chart of accounts and see if this is something you have, or when you're converting that you'll be setting up in the numeric chart of accounts. You can see here for a township, I guess maybe I have it pretty small here. For a township, under fiduciary funds, we have different agency funds that you might, or agency fund you may have set up. This is, you can check village and library as well to see if those apply. So if you have an agency fund set up, this is really answering a question. The question is, when you make a payment, do you have to set up an appropriation budget? Do you have to have a budget amount in place to make a payment when you're making a payment out of an agency fund? And the default for that in the system is they do not have to be budgeted. So that's just sort of an accounting rule practice that the auditors told us to include in here, is that they don't really require a budget for an agency type of fund. This is the exception to the rule. All the other funds, if you want to make a payment, you have to have an appropriation budget. For agency funds, you do not have to have an appropriation budget. Now, if for whatever reason you want to force the software to force you to have an appropriation budget in place for the agency fund, then you can select this option and it will force you to do that. So agency funds are like those funds that, well, like with the village, like a mayor's court, it's really not part of your village budget, for instance, with the agency fund. And that's by definition. So that's why it's not required to be part of, in our case, the Buckeye Township budget. So by default it's not, but you can force it to be so. Just be aware that once you have activity in this fund in the current year, you cannot change the settings. So if you change it here and then you realize, oh no, that means I have to set a budget amount, well, that's right. If you've already set the budget, you can't just flip back and forth between the settings. Once you get some activity in this fund, this is set for the year. All right, so we'll leave it on the default. Agency funds must not be budgeted. And then under UN backup interval, well, I think this applies to everyone. We'll see in the second lesson on this Chapter 6 how to perform UN backups. A backup is an external copy of the data, of your UN data. And in the UN software, you're forced to perform a backup every 30 days as a precaution in case there's a power surge and zap your computer, all that, it's electronic, everything's blasted on your computer, your hard drive shot, and you lost all the information. Well, you haven't lost it if you have it on a separate piece of media, flash or disk, outside of the computer. So it hasn't been lost, and then you can, with the help of UN tech support, if you get another computer, get the computer fixed, you can restore the backup. And at least, if it's November, if you keep it at the very minimum 30 days, then if this happens at the end of the year, at least you have all the transactions and information changes you made up until October, or whenever 30 days is passed. So it's a precaution. It says the setting cannot exceed 30 days, but you can certainly lower it to less than that, actually, all the way down to, type it in, where it'll force you to do a backup daily. You don't have to do that, but you can do that as a reminder to yourself to do a backup if you want daily backups, or anywhere in between 1 and 30 days. So what this does, I'll leave mine at 14 days. So I say I want to force myself to do backup every 2 weeks. So what this does is it'll allow you to log into the program, but if you try to perform a transaction and you reach that limit, then it'll force you to you won't be able to perform any transactions after that 14 days has passed. Now this does not mean, let's say I set this to 30 days. This does not mean that if you do backups more often, well, let's just say it the other way, does not mean that you have to do backups only 30 days when you have this setting. If you have it set to force you to do backup every 30 days, you can still do backup daily if you want to, or every week. This is just if maybe you go on vacation or something, you forget, or if you get out of the habit of doing your backups, this is going to force you to do it by this interval. So so in other words, on, let's say, September 1st, I record a backup, and then 15 days later, September 15th, I record another backup. Well, it's not going to force me to do another backup until October 15th, 30 days later. So it's always looking at that last day that you did a backup and adding another 30 days. So you may never be forced if you do backups more often than indicated here. Okay, so I'll change that to 14, like in the book. And then we'll move on to the module page. Well, this is actually a very easy module. It is, as you can see, I talked about the modules at the beginning of this lesson. Notice that cemetery, payroll is deactivated. They're grayed out. If I try to click on these, it doesn't open any menu. If you choose not to use the budget and inventory software, or if budget something's actually for your tax budget, if you use it once a year, and you don't want to accidentally, starting off, click on this and open up the menus and so forth in budget, well, what you can do is go to this entity setup and make it inactive, and inventory as well, and it'll gray it out just like with payroll and cemetery. So it's just a nice feature if you're not planning on using those modules to make them inactive, and then you won't accidentally select that item. But you can certainly keep them active and not use them, and that's another way to do it. All right, purchase orders. Well, I'll just show you this. I think on another version they're just getting rid of these options here, so you can just ignore them. It says do not default an expiration date. Well, this is talking about under accounting transactions, purchase orders. If you add a blanket certificate regular, when we first, in version number 1, we had the default expiration date. We found that there were some problems with that. We would automatically allow you to pick a generic default date. Well, now you have to pick. We have a version update since then, and now you have to pick that date. So you can kind of ignore these sections for right now. They will not set the default date, I believe. Well, I'll try one. We'll say the default date to the end of the year for both of these. Save it. So I'm just in doing this, I realize I'm not sure if that's set yet. So let me go to accounting transactions, purchase orders, and add a blanket certificate regular. And I was wrong, so I'm glad I showed you how to do it. If you set that default expiration date, notice how it filled in the end of the year. So if I look back under General Maintenance, Entity Setup, and go to Purchase Orders, you'll see that I had it set to the default expiration date to the end of the year. And if I look at my Add Purchase Orders form, this is for a blanket certificate regular, I believe, it filled in the expiration date at the end of the year. So it's just it saves you a couple seconds of clicking this date and selecting the end of the year. It's a nice little feature. You have many, many options. It's basically more complicated than it really looks. So we're talking about this expiration date for blanket certificate regulars or super. You could select defaults to the end of the year, to the end of the quarter. Do not default expiration date, and it'll be blank like the issue and certification date. And these are all the same for both types here, just these options. Default expiration date to, and then basically number of days after the issue date. So whenever the issue date is, it'll fill in. If I say January 5th and I say 5 days after that, it'll fill, my expiration date will automatically populate with January 10th. Or default expiration date to a specific date. You might want to do that on a rare occasion, but I would say for the most part it's here for very rare purposes, this expiration to a specific date, because eventually, well, as time goes on, you'll end up passing that date. So if you say default the expiration date to September 15th, well, today on my computer, my real date is September 7th. So once I get to September 16th, if I have this date set to September 15th, well, that's going to be kind of odd because my issue date will be December 15th and my expiration date will be December 15th, which, no, can't have that. Won't be allow you to save it. So I would say you probably don't want to use this very often. There might be some rare cases where you really want to remind yourself of a deadline that you might use that. And then eventually, of course, you'll have to change it to a later date once you reach the date that you've specified. So for now, I'm going to leave my settings to do not default expiration date. And I will say, I'll save that. Brings me back to entity information, and I'll get rid of this purchase order. Now, actually, we're almost through this, but I'll point out one thing. With the exception of this entity information page, some key things that you need to fill out here, like the tax ID and your name and assistant's name and so forth. For the most part, you can leave all of these settings. If you're converted to UN, you could leave them all to the default settings, and for the most part, most of you, it's not going to cause a problem. There's pretty. You can always come back later and review and say, oh, I want to change this setting here. But if you leave the default, you pretty much don't do harm. There's one thing here that's grayed out, this form layout. I'll just mention it. It's a future enhancement. And so we're kind of teasing you there. Eventually, you'll be able to design your own purchase order form. Right now, to print a purchase order blanket, you need to use the form that we've set up in UEN. Eventually, you'll be able to make some custom modifications of your purchase orders. But not now, and not for in the immediate future. We'll let you know in a version update and give you instructions on how to use that when the time comes. All right, so the last page of this entity setup form is the payments form. And that includes the warrant layout customization, or design your own warrant. Well, we actually, now the default is use standard warrant. And I'll say what my mom used to say to me, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I would say if you're converting to UEN, starting off, you've got your actual paper checks, your warrants, do a test printout. You know, print your first warrant. Instead of printing 10 warrants the first time you go to make a payment under accounting transactions, print one warrant and You mean it doesn't have to be a test warrant. Print an actual warrant and see if it prints okay onto your warrant paper. If it prints fine, then you never have to come here and consider using this custom layout. If it it doesn't print okay, then you want to plan ahead so you can do this before you have to get that check out with the mail. But print it out, or here you could print a. I'll show you. Click on Use Custom Layout. Click Design Warrant. It brings up another form here. As you can see, it's kind of technical. But if you look at the buttons at the bottom of the screen, it says Print a Test or Print Test. So you could put in paper, just regular warrant paper, regular plain white paper, print out a test, kind of hold it up to your warrant paper, and see if it lines up okay. If it doesn't, then you might want to graduate to printing it to an actual warrant, and if you're not sure, make sure and you avoid that warrant later as a misprinted check or something. But just determine it at first if it's okay. 99% of the time, it should be just fine when you're converted to UEN. So we provide you with, I believe, a sample set of checks from a print agency. But if you ever switch from your company and that doesn't seem to line up right, here's where you can customize it. We actually have a video and online recording. You can look up specifically about a 5-minute recording on how to use this. I'll just show you real quick that you can drag fields around. This is where your dollar amount goes on your paper checks. It's a little bit tricky in doing so. You're going to have to play around with printing and see if it lines up okay. But you can do that. You can save the information. You can reset it to default, so it'll come back. So you can't really do any harm in here. You can always reset it back to where it came from. And then again, you can save copies, reset a saved copy, etc. Watch that video for more information. We're back here under Entity Setup, and that would be Design Warrant. Again, if it's working, just leave it here under Standard Layout, and you're in good shape. All right, so I'm going to save any settings I might have changed there under Entity Setup, and that brings us to the conclusion of that section. I'll click on Close. And the next thing I'm going to show you is roles and users. This might not apply to some of you, but you can, just a brief exercise, and you can consider it. Even if you do not have a assistant. Most of our UAN customers do not have assistants. Some larger townships or villages, you got a lot of work. You might be lucky enough to have an assistant. And even some libraries have several people using the software. But if you don't have anyone helping you with the actual day-to-day transactions, you can still set up users with very limited access. And this might be good. This is kind of the soft sell for those of you who don't have assistants to consider this. If you got, say, with your township or village, you've got a board members or council members who are constantly asking you for reports to print out, updated reports on a weekly basis. And I've had people talk to me and say, yeah, they're always asking for these reports. I got to print them out. Is there any quick way of doing this? Well, one thing you can do is say, hey, if you'd like to that report, I can give you the option, even when I'm out of town, I can give you a username and password that allow you to get into the software, and you can restrict their access so that they can't do any damage to the software. Only thing they could do is print the reports that you tell the software to allow them to print. And that's it. You can set the access level to, in a lot of details, to the level of detail that you want. So maybe you do have an assistant, but you don't want that assistant to be able to do everything that you're able to do. Well, then you can set up a role for that person and limit the amount of access they have. So that's what we have here under General Maintenance Roles. And there are two default roles, administrator and power user. And I'll open up the users area too so you can see how these relate from the get-go. Here we've got our users. We only have one. That's our fiscal officer, Brutus Buckeye. You are automatically, as a fiscal officer, set up as the administrator. You have to have at least one administrator because an administrator, a user, this user Brutus, is assigned to the administrator role, and administrator roles have access to everything in the software. You can delete, you can void, you can do all post transactions, everything. So that's your role. Now you could set up maybe an assistant who is a power user. So maybe I'll call, and I'm not doing the exercise in the book, I'll have an assistant. So her name is Maya. So she's my assistant. And I'll set her up as a power user. And you can ignore this for now, this clearances. We'll save that. And, well, it says basically that when my assistant first logs in, she needs to type in her username, and her password is going to be the default, lowercase UEN, and then it's going to force her to change her password right away to her own custom password. So I click OK, and my assistant would be, if I set her up as I could set her up as administrator, but as a power user, she would not have access to all of these buttons, basically to roles or users. So basically, as administrator, I'm the manager. If I want to set up someone with a lot of access, I can make them a power user. They can pretty much do everything except fool with the roles and the users. Okay? So those are the preset roles you have. But what if you want, like I had mentioned, someone who has very limited access? Well, the first thing you want to do, you have to do, is assign a role. And then you'll set up the user and assign them to a role. Now, if I look here under Add for users, notice the first thing I have to do is name the user and assign them to a role. Well, if I don't have that role, that customized role in my already set up, I've got a problem, right? So I need to set up that role first. And the nice thing about the reason why we separate roles and users is because let's say I do want to give very limited access to my board or council members. Well, I don't have to do a lot of work. I only have to do the work once regarding the roles, limiting their access. And so in other words, I can set up one role and assign 5 different users for my 5 board members. I can assign all of them to that one role. I've done most of my work. I've done the work under the role section, and the users is very easy to add. So let's take a look at roles. This is a little bit. We're going to add a new role, and this is from our example on page 110. I'm going to call this role Reports Only. So whoever, by the description, you can kind of tell, whoever uses this role or is assigned to this role, well, they have access to view only accounting reports, and there's under the description. So access to view only accounting reports. So I've got my description for myself that kind of helps me later, because that way I don't have to page through this. I know that this is what it does. Now here this looks kind of complicated. It's not really that bad. Each one of these represents a module, each tab. And so per my description, I only want them to review accounting reports. So if I leave these checkboxes blank, that means they don't have access to budget transactions or budget reports, or displaying, adding, editing, or deleting them. Same thing for inventory, etc. There are some header fields here, so if I click this one, it selects everything below. But I don't want that. I don't want to have access to these areas or to the general module area. So that's what these tabs refer to, is each of these modules, to our current modules. And if I look under accounting, well, it says I want them to have access to accounting reports. Well, so I would look under the function name. These are accounting transactions utilities, so I want to scroll past that. Here we've got accounting maintenance. I don't want that. So here we've got accounting reports. It's separated, unfortunately a little confusing for you, by departmental and non-departmental. But right now, it doesn't make a difference, right? Because everything, we don't have that distinction of departments. That's something in the future release. So I'm just going to select the reports that I want to give them access to. Now I could technically give them access to just one thing. For instance, one section like fund reports. And that's it. So I could maybe relabel this fund reports, and that's all I would give them, my council, access just to that. But let's say I want to give them access to all of the accounting reports. So I click on this header checkbox. By filling that in, they'll have access to those reports. And then the header checkbox for the non-departmental will fill in those. Okay, so that's all I want to give them access to. So I click on Save. And that saves the role. I could add other roles, but I'll close that. So now we can see the reports only role is there. It doesn't do anything until I assign it to user. So let's select a user. I'm going to add a user per my exercise. We're going to 2B. We're going to add John. He's one of our trustees. So we'll select John. And this is username. You could put his full name or whatever you want. And select the role. These are reports only role. And here we've got, below that we've got clearances. Well, security clearance would allow John to view Social Security numbers and bank account information either in a software form or on reports. We don't want to give him access to that, so we're going to leave it blank. So maybe if this was your assistant or someone, but in most cases you probably just leave this blank, and that will not grant access to this user to that area. And then we've got compliance clearance. Well, we're going to talk about this when we get to the Chapter 7 under the entity setup, the compliance settings. But this relates to the compliance setting. It gives them, under certain conditions, access to compliance controls. Well, we don't want to give them access to compliance controls. In most cases, I venture to say in most cases you don't want to give most of your users access to this. So we're going to leave this blank. And unless fiscal officer has access to everything, but we'll click on Save, and now it gives us this information. Okay, John, here's his password when he first logs in. We just created John as a user, and there's his temporary password. So we could say for our, maybe Tim is a board member. Like I said, now that we've set up the reports only, all we have to do is add other users. Using that role. And so now I've got several users, and it gives you a little preview of what their controls are, what their role is, what their compliance clearances, etc. You can sort by these different column headings. Also, their password expires after several days as well. Now you can see here it expires immediately because I reset, because I just set them up. But eventually, it'll be driven by that entity setup, whatever I have in the interval, either at the minimum 30 days. Now, or at the minimum it must expire every 30 days. So there's passwords that will expire. If they forget their password, you can reset it here as an administrator. If you log in, you have access to using these buttons. So you could reset Tim's password. Let's say it expires and he forgot what his password expired. So now he's got to reset it. He forgot what his password was. He doesn't use this very often. You just click on Reset. It says it will reset it to the default lowercase un users. Click OK. And it's reset, and so you can tell Tim, hey, next time you log in with your username Tim, type in the UN, lowercase un, and it'll prompt you to enter in a new password. So you can manage everyone else's passwords. I suppose you could even reset your own password here it'll force you to log in under the UAN default. Although there's a better way to do that right here under change password for the current user that's logged in. And we'll get to that in the next lesson. But here you notice you can also delete users. So let's say Sally is no longer a board member. I could delete her off my list, and then she won't ever be able to log in under the username. Or maybe Tim, well, I just want to play a joke on him and I want to deactivate him. Now he's deactivated. Notice it disappeared. My status is active. If I select all, I can see that Tim is there, but he's deactivated. Well, we'll just say, you know, for whatever reason, you don't want to have that, give that person access at the time. You can deactivate. You can always come back to here and reactivate that person's username. All right, I think that about covers that. You can edit under users, see under roles, same idea, activate, deactivate, delete. Now you can't delete these if you have them tied to a user. You'd have to first delete the users or change the user's role. So you can see why the power user doesn't have access to these areas. They can't make any changes to other users or to you as the fiscal officer. So as an administrator, you've got the most control. Now you can set up 2 administrators. So you could make your assistant an administrator if you want to and give them full access to everything, just like you have. Okay, so that's the end of our exercises and end of part 1 in general maintenance. In the next lesson, we'll see how to record backups, change passwords, and we'll revisit vendor payees.